You know, whenever I lose my voice, I get a little bitter. That's what we're talking about today, as we continue our sermon series called Faith and Family Dysfunction. We're looking at God's first family, the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and Joseph, and seeing the dysfunction that was in them. We first started talking about anxiety with Abraham and Sarah, and how their anxiety caused them not to trust in what God was doing and caused havoc and dysfunction everywhere. Last week we talked about when Jacob and Esau were little boys and their mother Rebecca. And we saw how she triangulated the situation to make what happened what she wanted to happen. And it causes havoc and bitterness in that situation. And today we're talking about grown Jacob and Esau, and we're seeing how they are bitter, especially with Jacob. Everything Jacob does causes bitterness. I mean, his name is basically, I'm going to make you bitter. I'm going to grab your heel and pull you and dunk you down in the swimming pool. That's what his name is. That's what it means. And that situation with his mother and his father and how all of that went with the blessing and how he stole the blessing from his brother Esau, left Esau incensed and angry and just terribly bitter. So much so that Rebecca, that she thought that Esau was going to kill Isaac. So she goes, go live with my brother Laban. Go live with your uncle out there. Your brother Esau can't get you if you're living with your uncle Laban. And all of this happened because of bitterness. Right. Everything Jacob does causes bitterness. So he has to flee now from his incredibly incensed, angry brother Esau, and he lives with his uncle Laban there. So he goes there and he's going to live and work with him. But you got to remember, everything Jacob causes bitterness. And so he does that with his uncle too. Throughout the time he's with his uncle, he cleverly cheats him out of good sheep and goats. He never out and out steals. He just cheats him enough to really make someone bitter, make his uncle bitter. Well, while he's actually there living with his uncle, he sees two of his uncle's daughters, two cousins. He's like, this feels a little bit like Alabama right now. These cousins are looking nice. Actually, not both of them, just one of them. The younger one, Rachel, she is beautiful. This is like the peak cousin. She is beautiful there, and he really wants her for a wife, but he doesn't like the older one. The older one, she's described, her name's Leah, she's described as having weak eyes. I don't know what that means. I don't know what weak eyes mean, but so he goes to his uncle and he says, hey, I want to marry your younger daughter, Rachel. Let me marry her. And Laban's like, all right, you can do that, but you have to work for me for 7 years. So he makes him work 7 years, and he just thinks of Rachel constantly, never thinks of Leah, never thinks of weak eyes. Ugh. And so he just thinks of Rachel constantly, and it goes by so fast. And finally, the night of the wedding, and there's a huge wedding. Weddings back then were just days-long affair, and you can imagine just the drunken stupor. People didn't get drunk in the Bible. You can imagine the drunken stupor of going to bed, with his new wife, and the next day he's got the hangover, and he looks over at the beautiful Rachel, and oh, there's Leah, this weak eyes herself. He's like, that's not the cousin that I wanted to marry. That's not who I wanted to be. And he goes and yells at his uncle. It's like, you tricked me. You tricked me into doing this. As his uncle looks at all of his sheep that have been tricked out of him too. And he flies into a rage, and they try to work it out. And so he says, well, you can marry Rachel, but you have to wait another 7 years to marry your other cousin. You have to work another 7 years for me. You see, everywhere Jacob goes, he causes bitterness, even in his own family. He's got these two wives now, Leah and Rachel, and God ends up closing Rachel's womb so she can't have any kids, but he opens up Leah's, and Leah has a baby boy, and she names him Reuben. And listen to this. Can you imagine the bitterness of the heart that comes in here? She names him Reuben, which means, behold, a son. And the reason why she names him that is that she goes, God has seen my problem, and maybe my husband will love me now that I have a son. That's a level of bitterness and hurt that it can hardly be fathomed, right? It's awful. Everywhere Jacob goes, he causes nothing but bitterness. And in his own wife's womb has been closed up. See, his uncle Laban, he finally got tired of Jacob, all of his shenanigans and everything he's doing to cleverly breed his goats and sheep and all these things, and finally just kicks him out. He goes, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. The problem is Jacob has burned every bridge that he's ever crossed over, and he can't go back anywhere except for home. And it's been 20 years, and his brother Esau desperately wants to kill him still. He's still angry and bitter. Jacob has to go look at his bitterness straight in the eye and find out what is going on. And Esau has become powerful now. It's not just like, oh, you got Esau over there. He's got all these sons and wives and powerful. See, everywhere that Jacob goes, he causes bitterness. I think everywhere I look and see and almost feel right now, I see bitterness everywhere. I feel it everywhere. I even think of something as benign as going to Publix. And you go inside there, and wherever you are on the mask debate, whether you're pro or anti-mask, and you see people walking around the opposite of how you feel about it, it raises your temperature a little bit, gets you a little bitter. It's like, how dare those people act like that? Or how about the political climate that we've been going through the last couple seasons? It just seems like bitterness has just raised everyone's temperature up. And some of you are like, oh yeah, there's no issue. I don't have any issues with any of the political climate stuff. Like, whatever. I make a challenge to you. Maybe I'm short-sighted in this, but how many of you have better relationships with all of your family than you did 8 years ago? Whereas the bitterness that we've allowed to seep inside of us because of our modern political climate, we've allowed it to put a dividing wedge between us and our families. I mean, sure, it's easy to get bitter when someone steals something from us or takes something from us that we feel like that we should need or have. You know, when people are treated preferentially and that'll get us bitter. It's like, how come they're getting that? And bitterness can even come from a place we don't even remember. Like, you could have had a moment with your sibling where they received something you felt you did. You don't even remember that, but you could still remember the hatred that's gotten moved on each and every day as you've moved forward. Bitterness can make our lives just miserable, just awful, pits of Gehenna, you could say. You know, whether you have a colleague or a good friend that gets a promotion when you feel like you should have gotten it. Bitterness can seep in and destroy a friendship or a relationship. Or it even could be in your family, where you had a matriarch or a patriarch of your family play favorites with siblings or other people in the family. And that bitterness of those decisions still exists even to this day and controls and moves about the family. Everywhere we go, we can see and feel bitterness everywhere. And we see this is what happens to Jacob. His life is absolutely surrounded by bitterness everywhere. His wives have bitterness, his children has bitterness, and now he has to run home into the arms of his very bitter brother. What's going to happen? I mean, he's terrified that when his brother reaches around him for a hug, that there's going to be a dagger that's going to go in his back. So much dysfunction. And it seems like this cycle of bitterness is never going to end. So he finally gets on his knees. He has no hope. He's at the end of his very rope, and he says this. And it's found in Genesis 32, verse 9. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I'm not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I've become 2 whole camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children, But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand in the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. You see what he does? You see how he's handling it? That's what we call a confession. He confesses his sins before God. He confesses his bitterness before God. He confesses it probably to himself, but you can tell what's going on there. Like, he's bitter at everything. He's bitter about everything that's happened in his life, what's brought him to this situation. You can tell that he's even bitter with God. But God can handle Jacob's bitterness. So how about yourself? Have you confessed your bitterness? Have you confessed your bitterness that you have towards your brother or a colleague or someone else? Have you confessed your bitterness that you may even have towards God, that things haven't worked out the way you thought they would? Or are you still holding on to that bitterness? Holding on to it, letting the bitterness live free and have free reign over your entire being, causing dysfunction and havoc in your life? Are you confessing your bitterness and brokenness? Or are you letting it just sit there, reminding you again and again, day after day, exactly how angry you actually are, wondering if there's ever going to be any hope? You see, Jacob finally confesses, and God acts. That very night, God comes down and wrestles with Jacob all night. But he doesn't kill him. He doesn't hurt him. He doesn't overwhelm him. All that, he just wrestles with him. All night he wrestles with him. God wrestles with Jacob. And Jacob has been fighting everyone his whole life. And he now fights this shadowy figure who we know to be God. And they wrestle all night long. I mean, imagine Jacob. He's been looking for a fight. All he wants to do is fight his entire life. You can just imagine the veracity and the hatred and the wanting of Jacob just to rain blows down onto something, just all that bitterness, pent up aggression, all those things. Nothing in life has been easy for him, and he's just bitter to his core. But God wrestles with him all night long, wrestles and wrestles and wrestles. And with each blow, each throwing down and hit the ground, each time a punch lands, bitterness is spit out all over the ground. Bitterness is expelled. The fight expends all that bitterness there when he's wrestling and fighting with God. And it finally looks like Jacob has bested this shadowy figure of God himself and holds him down. It's like, you're going to bless me. And in that moment, God, that shadowy figure, pinned by Jacob, right, touches his hip and wrenches it out of socket, throwing Jacob off of him as he walked in pain. And God looks at him and blesses him and says, Jacob, you will no longer be known as the factory of bitterness. That's what Jacob means, basically, a factory of bitterness. You will no longer be known as that. You will now be known as Israel, which means wrestles with God. What I love about that story is that Jacob wrestles with God. That God is bigger, he's stronger than any of the bitterness or the wrestling or the doubt or the hurt or any of that stuff that we feel like God would get angry and strike us down. He wrestled him. But Jacob didn't walk away with nothing. He walked away with a limp after wrestling with God. And that same name, Israel, like wrestles with God, that's the identity for an entire group of people. God's people were always wrestling with God, weren't they? And Jesus, the Son of God, like when we talk about him, that he is the true Israelite, that he embodies the entirety of God's people and how they wrestle with God. And boy, did he come to wrestle, and wrestle he did, because he came and he wrestled all of our struggle, all of our pain, all of our hurt, the bitterness, the hurts that we've caused others, the bitterness that we caused, and he wrestled it all the way to the cross, and he wrestled with it to wounded him, where his holes in his hands in his side, but he didn't stay dead. He rose again, but with hands inside, like Jacob, is still wounded and can probably feel those scars as he healed us all. You see, for Jacob, once he wrestled with God, he then can move forward knowing that God is above all of this. And he crosses the river and goes to his brother Esau. And he doesn't go with any bitterness or contempt or fear, but he goes over and he gets on his knees before Esau with forgiveness on his heart and forgives him and goes to his brother Esau as a servant. He bows down before his brother. Not once or twice, but 7 full times, he bows down to his brother Esau. And Esau, with that forgiveness that he sees, he embraces his brother that he has now received back with love. You see, confession and forgiveness and even wrestling with God, the cross, has ended the bitterness. So here's the point of all of this. I think there's a lot of times people are like, you can't wrestle with God. You can't question him. You can't do any of that. Like, the entire identity of God's people is that they wrestle with God. Boy, do they, right? They wrestle with him all the time. It's okay to wrestle with him. It's okay to struggle with him. It's okay to be there with him. But know that God has sent Jesus, and Jesus himself wrestles with God for you on your behalf. And there's nothing that you have to worry about with him, that God can handle the wrestling. He can handle the struggle. He can handle even your bitterness. So when you're bitter, confess it. Confess how you have taken part in that bitterness, how you have caused some of that bitterness. Realize where you are. Realize how bad things are. Realize what's going on. Then maybe you can start alleviating some of that bitterness. And when it comes down to it, you can wrestle with God. You can be like Israel. But when you wrestle with God, there is a warning. You might come away wounded. Our father Jacob walked with a limp after wrestling with God for the rest of his life, but I think his bitterness went away. He walked away with a limp for his entire life, and you may get wounded, but Paul, the Apostle Paul, says that's the entire message of God's people, is that we may walk away wounded. And the way we view it as Christians is the way Paul says it, is we take up our cross. We take up our woundedness. We take up our wrestling with Godness on the cross there. We take up our cross. We take up that cross of Jesus and we wrestle with God and we go to forwards, because at the cross, our bitterness can wipe away from us, because at the cross, our bitterness is purged from us, because we realize that we are a people that are forgiven at the cross. And when we are taking up our crosses, we can be places of forgiveness with everyone that is around us. So may God bless you as you go through whatever you got to go through, any amount of wrestling, that we may pick up our crosses and follow after Jesus. May God bless you and give you interesting wounds. We'll see you next week.